Well, back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Richard Hasen, the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. He's a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation, and is co-author of the leading casebook on election law. He served as a founding co-editor of the quarterly peer-reviewed publication Election Law Journal, and is the author of a number of books, including The Voting Wars, Plutocrats United, The Justice of Contradictions, and Election Meltdown. And his forthcoming book is Cheap Speech, How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. Welcome to Background Briefing, Richard Hasen.
Good to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you're quoted in, I think, a very important cover article in The Atlantic recently by Barton Gellman. Trump's next coup has already begun. You're quoted saying, quote, "The democratic emergency is already here. We face a serious risk that American democracy as we know it will come to an end in 2024, but urgent action is not happening." So what explains, because I share your concerns, and I've interviewed a number of people on this subject, that we seem to be heading towards a kind of one-party state to the sort of election autocracy that you have in Hungary, for example, or even in Putin's Russia. And I don't understand, Rick, why isn't the body politic more alarmed, and particularly the Democratic Party? Or maybe they are. Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, I think that a big part of the explanation for lack of action is exhaustion. We're in the middle of the pandemic. Still, 2 years in, we're still recovering from the Trump presidency. And, if you look at the ratings of television news channels, and you look at the subscriptions to newspapers and websites, news websites, things are down because people are checked out, they're tuned out. And I think Democrats came in, they had a very big agenda of things they wanted to accomplish. And they know that focusing more on Trump doesn't necessarily help them to gain in popularity. So I think Democrats have been in denial about the need to deal with the risk of election subversion. And of course, Republicans either are going along with what Trump is doing or they're afraid of Trump. And they're certainly not going to be leading on this question. It's hard to get just even a handful of Republicans in Congress to agree that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. I think there was a real missed moment in the period right after the insurrection, right after Biden was inaugurated, when there could have been movement towards a bipartisan compromise legislation to try to deal with these things. But that moment is now long behind us.
Well, that moment actually was signaled by none other than Mitch McConnell, who, after the coup on January the 6th, or the coup attempt, I should say, on January the 6th, on, I think, the early morning of January the 7th, he took to the Senate floor and talked about how these thugs are not going to intimidate us in the Senate. And then he went on to basically give the Democrats a roadmap, saying that Trump is morally and practically responsible for what just happened, and you can sue this guy. And the distinct impression I got was that he was sort of signaling, let's do something about it, and nothing happened. And shortly thereafter, even though the minority leader of the House, Kevin McCarthy, had condemned Trump initially, he then turned around and talked about election suppression, and 147 Republicans in the House voted not to certify Biden's victory only hours after they were intimidated, cowering under their chairs, frightened for their lives during the insurrection. So,
right. Yeah, no, you look at Mitch McConnell, and he voted against conviction on the impeachment charges against Trump, despite what he had said right after the insurrection. I think there's a real fear among Republicans. Donald Trump is by far the most popular Republican leader in the Republican Party. It's very obvious what happens if you go up against Trump. Even those Republicans who voted for the infrastructure bill are now facing primaries or threats of primaries by challengers that Trump will back. So he's got a grip on the Republican Party. And these Republican legislators, they feel pressure from above from Trump, and they feel pressure from below from their base. Millions of Trump voters believe the false claim that the 2020 election has been stolen and want to see action so that it won't be stolen again. And if you really believe the election was stolen, of course you'd want to see, steps taken to clamp down on fraud and irregularities. So I think, we're in a very tough shape because Republicans are not going to be partners in this. And it's very hard for Democrats to go alone. But the Democrats kind of have their head in the sand. There was a quote from a Biden official a few months ago in the New York Times when asked about the risk of subversion. His answer was, well, Democrats just need to win more elections, as though you can have a fair election and and then solve it that way. The fact is that Democrats now control the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And if there's any time to act, it's now.
Well, but they don't control Joe Manchin, and he's just let it be known that he's not interested in altering the filibuster rules, and he's not negotiating with Biden over the Build Back Better.
Right. So I think Democrats are scrambling now to figure out what they're going to do about that. And, just over the last couple of days, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has been talking about, bringing voting bills back to the floor and trying to get everyone on the record on what they're going to do about the filibuster. Whether this is going to motivate Manchin and Sinema to change their views, I don't know. But there's been dragging on for so long, and people I respect seem to think that there actually is a chance that something could happen. So I'm waiting to see. But so far there's been no action. And of course, those bills would make a lot of changes in how elections are run, but they do very little to deal with the risk of election subversion. They're much more about voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, campaign finance disclosure, lots of things that have been on Democrats' voting agenda for a while, but not really focused on the risk that an election loser could be declared the election winner, which to me is at the top of my list of concerns right now.
And again, I'm speaking with Richard Hasen, who's the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. He's a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation and is co-author of a leading casebook on election law, and he serves as the founding co-editor of the quarterly peer-reviewed publication Election Law Journal, and is the author of a number of books, including The Voting Wars, Plutocrats United, The Justice of Contradictions, and Election Meltdown. And his forthcoming book is Cheap Speech, How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. And indeed, even the gerrymandering and all the other provisions that they have in the John Lewis bill and in Manchin's bill as well in the Senate, they'll be challenged in the court. So they won't necessarily come into play in any case before 2022. So let's talk about what your concerns are, given that I take it that you feel that we have election norms in this country that are now being broken, but we don't have election laws.
Well, so we do have election laws, but they're porous. And, there's something completely different about how the presidential election is run compared to every other election in the United States. There's no other election like the presidency where, we're conducting elections by state and within each state by locality. And then there's a whole process by which after those votes are counted, they have to be certified. And then the governor has to sign a certification that has to be mailed to Congress, and the envelopes have to be opened, and there has to be a vote in Congress to certify. All of that suggests that there are lots of pressure points where someone who's trying to manipulate an election result could exert pressure. That's exactly what Trump tried to do in the 2020 election. And I'm concerned that his attempts have kind of laid out a roadmap for how it could work more successfully in the future. And as you said, what this reveals is that much of our system depends on norms and people acting in good faith rather than explicit rules, which suggests that one of the things that we should be doing now is changing those rules so that there's less slack in the system and fewer opportunities to be able to manipulate things.
Well, there's also, along with gerrymandering, voter suppression, and I take it what you're concerned about is state legislatures changing the rules so that they get to certify and count the vote, and if they don't like it, they can change it. That is possibly the most alarming aspect. But there's also something else going on that Bannon and General Michael Flynn and others are involved in, with financing from the Overstock former CEO Patrick Byrne and others, at the precinct level, at the voting level, they're intimidating traditionally neutral poll workers, driving them out, and then having partisans elected. I mean, look at the state of Georgia, for example. Brad Raffensperger did the right thing, even though he was vilified and his family had to move out of their home because of death threats. He's being challenged by Jody Heiss, who's one of these Stop the Steal Trumpsters, and he's likely to get elected as the Secretary of State in Georgia, overseeing the next election, and it's the same is true in Arizona as well.
Well, so there's going to be a huge battle now in states like Arizona and Georgia, where Democrats do have a chance to win election against these people who have embraced the false claims that the election in 2020 was stolen. I think it presents a huge challenge because even if these candidates come into office and try to administer the election as fairly as possible, just giving them the benefit of the doubt, why would Democrats believe that they would administer the election fairly, given their statements about what happened in 2020? You know, if you're going to lie about what happened in 2020, why should we believe what you say about an election in 2024? And so I'm very concerned that the kind of skepticism that Trump has been able to engender among Republicans is going to spread to Democrats if elections are run by these Trumpists in 2024. And what a democracy requires is that you hold a fair election and that the losers accept the results as legitimate. When you don't have that, you don't have a functioning democracy. And that's really what's potentially undermined by having poll workers and election officials be those who have publicly embraced the false claims that the 2020 election was stolen.
So without trust, and you're suggesting that there's little trust on both the left and the right, it's difficult to see how we can function. And this surely goes beyond just changing these antique laws like the Electoral Count Act. Am I correct?
The changing the Electoral Count Act would help, but it's not going to be enough to deal with this kind of problem. That's certainly true.
So what could be done?
Well, there's a lot of things that I think should be done. You know, changing the Electoral Count Act is one legal change. Another one is requiring that everyone who votes in this country votes on a voting machine that produces a piece of paper. Right now, I think we have about 12% of people who vote on wholly electronic voting machines. I mean, just imagine what Georgia would have been like if we couldn't have a hand recount of all of those ballots for president, as they did, to kind of assure that the election was fairly conducted.
And the same in Arizona, too, right?
Yes, right. But in parts of Texas, Louisiana, there are parts of the country that, and until recently Pennsylvania, that have been using electronic voting machines. And I think that's a huge problem. So there's a lot of legal changes that could be made. I have a paper coming out in the Harvard Law Review Forum, which your listeners can find a draft posted on the SSRN website. It's called Identifying and Minimizing the Risk of Stolen Elections and Election Subversion in the Contemporary United States. And I lay out a whole bunch of changes, including changes such as raising criminal penalties for attempting to interfere with official election proceedings. But ultimately, I conclude that law is only as powerful as people's willingness to obey it. And if people are going to be lawless, it's going to take a political movement and not just legal change in order to assure that we continue to have free and fair elections in the United States. And that means cross-partisan coalitions between Democrats, Republicans, independents, and others to assure that there is pressure against those who would change or bend the rules or look to manipulate election outcomes so that we do not have the risk to the rule of law and to fair elections.
Yeah, but what do you do about the Republican Party and its apparent attitude? It's obviously, one, it's Trump's party now, and two, even people that hate Trump, like Mitch McConnell, they're against any of these bills. I mean, when you talk about the need to get Manchin and Sinema on board, well, none of the Republicans are on board, not even the relatively moderate and decent ones like Mitt Romney. They're not on board.
Yeah, but those bills are not about preventing election subversion.
Right.
You know, those bills are about dealing with partisan gerrymandering and campaign finance reform and lots of other things that, many things I support.
Right, but the Republicans aren't speaking out against election subversion. I mean, it seems like they would rather cheat than compete.
Well, I think the Republican Party is divided, and I think that there are people of good faith in that party who could find a willingness to go along with something. For example, there have been Republican co-sponsors in the past of bills that would require paper ballots for all elections. So, I think there is room for change. But as I said earlier, it's hard when you don't have a party that is uniformly committed to democracy. And so then you have to work with whichever members of that party there are who are willing to go along with trying to push this. And there has to be, even if it's only 20% of Republicans who strongly object to this attempt to subvert democracy, Republicans need those 20%. And so, the idea would be to fracture that coalition if Republicans are not willing to go along with some form of preserving the rule of law and the rules for conducting fair elections.
So just in closing, what was the website that you mentioned where you have your paper at Harvard, SSRN?
SSRN.com is a repository of forthcoming and recent papers. And if you go there, you just search for my last name. You should be able to find that. Hasen. That's right. You should be able to find the paper there. Or it's also linked on my website. This may be easier. Just go to electionlawblog.org, and you'll find it on the right-hand side under recent and forthcoming papers.
Well, Richard Hasen, I thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Richard Hasen, who is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. He's a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation, and is co-author of a leading casebook on election law, and he serves as the founding co-editor of the quarterly peer-reviewed publication Election Law Journal, and is the author of a number of books including The Voting Wars, Plutocrats United, The Justice of Contradictions, and Election Meltdown, and his forthcoming book is Cheap Speech, How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate or publictruthmedia.org, where you will find our non-profit Public Truth Media Foundation, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And if you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic, and have made it easy for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we also encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared by 9:30. Who'll ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice saying something to me. An angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. And the other became a car skidded into the rain, making the last little one to say, one more light goes out in the